Alright, it is July 30 of 2026. We dove into Mark 14 today. Further on the topic of the plot to kill Jesus, Judas and his betraying, the Passover, and the disciples and their forsaking of Christ. Just further into all that, this time in the Gospel of Mark. So more to dig out, and a really interesting, unique passage, solely specific and unique to Mark. We'll get into that at the end, but I don't know, interesting stuff. But yeah, let's get right into it. First thing I want to point out is kind of the timeline and everything. I was going over that in my last video, which was, I know, a couple days ago. Work got stupid, waking up at freaking 4:45 to go in at 6, and just early days and long days, and that's been my past 3 days. So we're back though. Off for the 4th today. It's a Friday, so we're off for the 4th, the 3rd of the 4th. So we're back. But yeah, anyways, further in the timeline, we see a specific quote that says, "After 2 days." Then it was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was an 8-day celebration. But after 2 days, that implies there's a day that was before these after 2 days, and there's a day that is after these 2 days. And looking into the notes on my MacArthur Study Bible and all, he spoke of Friday when he was saying after 2 days. When he says after 2 days, it was now the Passover, right, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would have started on a Friday, which means when he spoke was a Wednesday. And we know that the Friday was the Passover. That was when he was taken and beaten, right? And then the day, that night, that evening, whatever, that would have been the next day. That evening, that would have been his crucifixion. It all lines up to be Friday, right? So that's kind of interesting, and the notes really lay it out. It's a long section of notes, but they lay it out, and it's true. Like, that is the most logical way to put it. Like, people argue Wednesday was the crucifixion or the resurrection. They think Friday was the resurrection, right? So Wednesday being the crucifixion. It doesn't, we don't see that lines up. Scripturally, contextually, through the different Gospels, this lines up, and this even says it lines up in the note, lines up with Matthew, which I looked back and it does. It's true. It all lines up the same quotes are there. It's just fitting for it to have been a weekend, resurrection, crucifixion, everything, right? Along with the Passover, which is when the Passover started, was the weekend. So all in all, that's really interesting that it lines up that way. And I'm inclined to believe that's true. Again, I need to do more research, but get different views on it. But yeah, I'm inclined to believe this is the way it happened. So interesting stuff. We move further into the anointing with the spikenard, Judas and his betrayal, the Passover, and then we get into the prayer in the garden, which is where I caught something. Verse 37, Christ was imploring them to stay awake, right? To be awake while he was praying. We see several different times, I think 3 different times, that he calls them to do so. He's calling them to stay awake, to pray over themselves and the temptation, the spiritual warfare that they would be going over in just moments, right? If not hours. Like, that's how soon it would be happening. He was calling them, like, you're going to see some temptation coming up. He actually says, verse 38, which I love this verse, "Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." That's true. Our spirits are always willing. We always think we know we can do what we need to do. But our flesh holds us back, spiritually, physically, every time, right? He's calling them to stay awake, to prepare themselves with prayer for temptation to be upon them shortly, and it was, and we know they failed. Peter denied, the others forsaked Christ. They failed, and that began with them failing to stay awake and being prepared. So I think what we can take from that is to always be prepared, right? That verse, to watch and pray always over our temptations, They're different at different times, but they're all present within each of us. We all have our own personal temptations, and we must watch, we must pray, we must be prepared and ready for that spiritual warfare when it comes, because it comes. And last thing I pointed out, we then had the betrayal and the arrest, and then there's this interesting 2-verse passage. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's short, but I'm going to read it, titled, "A Young Man Flees Naked. Now a certain young man followed him, Christ, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." So I had to dig into my notes for this, obviously. And it's suspected that this young man is actually Mark. And my note says, if the mob under Judas's guidance had first gone to Mark's mother's house in search of Jesus, which is often where they stayed, we know that contextually, and also this house, Mark's mother's house, was possibly where the last Passover was actually observed by Jesus, by the 12, right? Mark could have heard the noise of the people coming, suspected what was happening, and hurried to follow the multitude. And then the linen cloth, it says either a loose-fitting linen sleeping garment or a sheet that Mark had wrapped around him hastily after being awoken and hearing the noise, right? So crazy. And if that was Mark was the one who wrote this account. I'm reading Mark right now, right? He's the author. So he talked of himself. He talked of that own, like, eyewitness, right? Eyewitness account of himself fleeing naked. It's like, what? It's crazy. But that still raises the question, was the last Passover in his mother's house? Was it not? I guess arguable. But really interesting, like, random passage. It is unique to Mark. I looked that up. It is unique to Mark. It's weird. I don't really know what to gain out of that, but that's that. And it was cool to have the note to kind of understand that further. I would have no clue what that means otherwise. But yeah, and then Jesus faces the Sanhedrin. That's where they start getting violent and bearing false witness against him. And then Peter denies. So that's Mark 14. We're gonna keep going into these. I think next might probably John, Matthew, Mark, John. We'll see. But yeah, have a good 4th.